Coach, my CNS is fatigued. I'm so tired. I can't do anything. We've all heard strength athletes say, I got a fried CNS, bro. I'm so toast. And have zero clue what that even means from a physiological perspective, or if they even have a CNS that is indeed fried, right? So if that's you and you want to learn more about what a fried CNS is, stay tuned to the rest of this video. What's up, everybody? I'm Dane Miller from Garage Strength, and one of the things that we hear pretty frequently here at Garage Strength is, Coach, no Dane, my CNS is fried, bro. And it's bull. Okay, so what does it mean to even have, it's bull sometimes. Sometimes it's actually accurate, but working with power-based athletes, okay, Olympic weightlifting, throwing, football, field hockey, wrestling, any of these sports where we are going to be pushing a significant amount of weight pretty regularly, and we're going to be pushing our workouts close to failure pretty frequently, and on top of that, pretty long workouts where you might have a throwing session that lasts an hour, and then you might have a lifting session that lasts an hour and a half to 2 hours. Well, now your nervous system is excited for over 3 hours. And one of the things that ends up happening is we've got to understand when we're talking about a fried CNS, what does that even mean? Okay, so we've got to recognize that dopamine and adrenaline and a little bit of glutamate is responsible for the excitability of our nervous system. So firing up our nervous system, making sure that we are prepared and ready to put out a significant amount of force into our training. So if we do have a high intense training session for a long period of time, we can have elevated dopamine levels in our blood and elevated adrenaline on the adrenergic receptor sites. And so too much of this for too long can create somewhat of a problem, especially if we're training later in the evening, and it could have a negative impact on our sleep, especially if we're utilizing caffeine. Now, one of the things that we've got to be clear about is that caffeine is so effective because of the way it interacts with dopamine. Caffeine can create a large amount of dopamine into our blood, and it takes the dopamine a little bit longer to go through the body and come back to the brain. And that's what helps our nervous system fire at a higher rate when we drink caffeine, when we have 300 milligrams to 500 milligrams, something along those lines. And so what ends up happening is that if we have regular training sessions all the time at a very, very high intensity, it can have a long activation period of dopamine and adrenaline, which those two neurotransmitters are what makes us feel good. It makes us feel strong. It makes us feel motivated. Okay, but then the negative impact could be, now all of a sudden we have a training session at 5 o'clock in the evening and we train for 2 to 3 hours, and our dopamine levels are excited for a long period of time because of our training duration. And then we try to get to bed, but our dopamine levels are very high and our serotonin levels are low. And our serotonin it's a very important neurotransmitter to help put us to sleep, to try and calm us down and to try and down-regulate the nervous system so that we can relax and we can start to recover while we go through our sleep patterns and actually recover from those high intense training sessions. And so some of the signs that we might have are we have low motivation mentally. We struggle to get into the gym. We struggle to have any motivation to actually want to get better. We struggle with even fine motor skills, as in you get out of the car and you feel like you're gonna trip over your own feet. You got a little bit of brain fog or something along those lines. And what ends up happening is a lot of people will say consistently, my CNS is fried, and they're saying this week after week after week, but they're just training. A lot of times, most of the time, you're literally just training, especially if you're an elite athlete. If you are a world-class athlete, you likely have more dopamine receptors. So you can handle higher levels of power output over longer periods of time than a normal person. So most elite athletes, most world-class athletes have more dopamine receptors. That's why they are more inclined to be risk takers, to party a little bit more, to do crazy stuff, to do drugs, to do stuff like that, because they're constantly looking for that fix for their dopamine receptors, because that's the stuff that they get off on. And so one of the major signs though, that if you do have this, is that when you fall asleep, you're in bed and you can fall asleep pretty quickly. But within an hour and a half to 2 hours, you're waking up and you can't fall back asleep. So that's one of the major signs behind having a fried CNS. Oftentimes people will say, well, I could barely get out of bed. But if you could barely get out of bed, if you sleep through the night, you have a long night of sleep and you still feel fatigued in the morning, that's typically going to be related much more so to the fatigue of your muscles, not to your CNS. So the CNS, if we can think about when we're waking up in the middle of the night, if we go to bed and we have our dopamine is high, okay? So we have high dopamine, but we're able to fall asleep. What ends up happening is now our sleep pattern gets a little screwy. Our serotonin is not regulated properly. Our cortisol might be too high during the day. During this training session, when our dopamine might be high, we're using a lot of dopamine, we're using a lot of adrenaline, and now we need to start to bring in cortisol at the end of our training session to help us during our wake period. So now our cortisol goes up and it can really have a negative impact on our sleep pattern. So then we go to sleep, our dopamine's too high, our cortisol's too high prior to sleep, and it should be when we are sleeping, our serotonin's high, our dopamine's low, and our cortisol starts to rise, especially as we start to wake up in the morning. But it's sort of this reverse pattern, and that is a telltale sign that you do indeed have a fried CNS. If you're waking up in the middle of the night and you're really, really struggling to fall back asleep, that's related to what's going on with those neurotransmitters. And so how can we handle this? How can we reverse the side effects of having a fried CNS? Some of the most important parts behind this is if you're going to be using caffeine, typically don't use it after 2:30 in the afternoon. If you have a training session at 4 or 5 in the afternoon, pick 2 to 3 days a week that you will use caffeine, okay, if you have to train in the evening, but make sure that after your training session, you're doing things that will increase the release of serotonin and drop down dopamine in your bloodstream. So get off your cell phone. We know that social media and likes and hearts and thumbs up actually increases our dopamine. If we're getting off social media, if we're focusing on meditation or prayer, we know that we can downregulate our dopamine, and over time we can calm down our nervous system. And remember, that's the whole key behind that fried CNS, is that we've got to relax our nervous system. So meditation, prayer, get off your cell phones, turn off the TV, turn the lights down significantly, or turn the lights off and use candles. It works. It can tremendously impact your CNS so that you are capable of recovering from those high intense training sessions, and that will lead to having a greater functioning CNS if your CNS is indeed fried. So we go over all this stuff in our 6 keys to programming that you can download for free down below. We've got 6 keys that every single weightlifting program has to have. You can download that for free. Please head over to GarageStrength.com. You can check out all of our products. Like, subscribe, share this video all over the internet, especially if you've got that friend who thinks their nervous system is fried. Comment down below. Let them know they're probably not struggling with the fried CNS. Peace.